I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingnews.com, and here today with me is JP Cortez, Executive Director at the Sound Money Defense League. Thank you so much for being here. Great to have you.
Hi, Charlotte. Thank you for having me.
Of course, really good to be catching up with you, and I think it's the perfect time. We are going to go over some relatively recent current events. So last week, we had a new bill introduced in the U.S. that essentially would bring an audit of U.S. gold reserves, including Fort Knox. So we're going to get into the details, but I thought if you could just start with the basics about what we should know about this bill.
Absolutely. So this bill is House Bill 3795 by Congressman Thomas Massie. There are already 3 other co-sponsors, so 4 U.S. representatives came together to introduce this bill, which would give us the first comprehensive audit of America's gold in decades, in about 65 years. There have been audits, quote unquote, done in the past, none of which meet or comport to audit standards of today that a private depository would be facing. And there are a lot of legitimate questions surrounding America's gold holdings. So this bill, for the first time in decades, would call for a full inventory of the gold stored in Fort Knox and other places where America's gold is purportedly stored. So not just Fort Knox, but Denver, the West Point vaults in New York. All of those would be subject to deep examination as well. So it calls for a full inventory, a physical inventory, an audit, which would be a full assaying, making sure that the metals are indeed metals, and then a full accounting of all transactions involving America's gold over the last 50 years. There's also not only questions about whether or not the gold is physically there, but questions about who owns it. If it is there, has it been swapped? Has it been leased? Has it been encumbered in any way? So there are a bunch of really legitimate questions that deserve answers. And the truth is, it's a little bit crazy that this requires an act of Congress at all. You know, a proper steward of America's money or of America's gold holdings would be offering this transparently. They would offer reports and audits and financial statements. But for whatever reason, America's monetary bettors have decided that they're not willing to do this. And because of that, we now have to force them through an act of Congress. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, it is a little bit crazy when you put it that way to think that it has to come to this. So you've raised a lot of points. There's a lot of different paths we can go down here. One thing I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned that there's been a little bit of auditing done in the past, but it's not up to standard. It's not what we need to see. So can you describe what those previous audits looked like and how this is going to be different?
Well, I will say from the jump, the reason that we have this a font of knowledge about auditing is our connection, the Sound Money Defense League's connection with Money Metals Depository and Money Metals Exchange, who own a depository, the largest depository in North America, in Idaho. And so because of that, we are intimately knowledgeable with what an audit takes and what an audit is, and importantly, what an audit isn't. In the case of these audits that supposedly have been done, these aren't audits that have been done on the metal themselves, but rather the storage containers that the metal is supposedly stored in. So a long time ago, the United States government says that they audited the gold, and there are questions around those audits because those audit reports have been lost. They have been reported missing. They cannot be found. But despite that, the gold, quote unquote, has been audited. And since then, the managers of America's gold have been auditing the seals, have been auditing the cases that the gold is supposedly in rather than the gold itself. Again, with our knowledge from the auditing process with Money Metals Depository, we know that that's absolutely not the way it should be. Anytime a case is opened, it must be re-audited. There are questions of broken seals and moved compartments. All of that is done by metals gold researcher Jan Nieuwenhuis, who has been for years tracking this international news, proving that there are a lot of questions surrounding these moved vaults, these moved containers, these broken seals, with no questions and no re-auditing that's been done. So this, of course, like I mentioned, would not pass muster in a private depository. Owners, operators of a depository who functioned like this would go to jail. They would be charged for fraud and deceit. And so these audits have been not too standard. And so that's why this bill would comport to these standards at a time where the White House, President Trump has already talked about supporting this measure, has talked about making sure we want to go to Fort Knox and make sure that the gold is there. So while he hasn't come out and supported HR 3795, he is obviously in support of the larger audit of gold, which is important at a time where countries all over are loudly talking about finding other payment settlement alternatives, finding alternatives to the US dollar or the Federal Reserve note, and at a time where countries are actively talking about repatriating their gold out of American custody. Most recently, Germany talking about considering out loud whether or not their gold is in safe storage here in the United States. So this would re-inject transparency at a time where confidence in the American dollar seems to be waning.
Yeah, I think this is definitely such an important time to be looking at this, and we'll get into what kind of support we may see here. Before we go there, I just want to highlight, you mentioned this is not just about Fort Knox, it is about Fort Knox, but it's also about the U.S. gold reserves in their entirety, and these are in different locations. So anything else you would highlight there, because I think that's also important to understand.
That's exactly right. So this bill, and it's a common misconception. I think a lot of people look at or think about America's gold holdings and they think Fort Knox. And to be sure, a lot of gold holdings, both American and other countries, are stored in Fort Knox, but that's not where all of it is stored. And so it's very important when we're writing this legislation to not be ambiguous or to be vague, because a bill that is drafted improperly would allow for the government to, for example, audit maybe Fort Knox and not the other vaults. Or, for example, would allow vaults or audits that are not simultaneous. So you're auditing vaults at different times, which are easier to manipulate. So the bill makes sure to include the safeguards that don't allow for a government to manipulate the results or for any sort of dishonesty to make its way through. When the last audit took place several decades ago, what they did was they opened the vault doors and they brought in TV cameras and they brought in lawmakers. They showed them pre-approved bars out of pre-approved containers without a single bar being weighed or assayed or a single serial number matched. And I fear that that's what will happen. Well, fortunately, we have this bill, so the structure now is more clear. But when Elon Musk recently was talking about wanting to do a live stream of America's gold at Fort Knox, we're at the risk of being tricked by the same dog and pony show that took place decades ago. We cannot settle for a live showing or a camera made for TV movie. We need a full comprehensive audit. That's not a digital live stream or a space on X will not suffice or is not a substitute for a true assay, a true audit, and every single transaction that gold was involved in. Whether it's to other countries, was it to the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements? There are a lot of legitimate questions and a lot of gold movement through times of war, through times of turbulence, where countries have moved gold here, moved it out. And again, like I said, there's a bipartisan support today for transparency in government. More than ever before, they're talking about maybe addressing waste and fraud and abuse. And that's what they say on the right. That's what Republicans say. Democrats regularly talk about the importance of transparency and how government institutions are supposed to work for the people. This is the great intersection where both political parties can get what they supposedly want, and the American people and worldwide can be assured that our gold is in fact there, and the greatest monetary asset of all time, of which America supposedly has the greatest stockpile of in the world, is there.
It does sound like this is really an opportunity for both sides to work together, like you're saying. And I also want to pick up on another of the topics you're mentioning there. So when we talk about these audits, there's the question of, is the gold there? And also, who does it belong to? Does it really belong to the US? So anything further you would elucidate there?
Well, that is the $1 million question, because you could argue about whether or not the gold is physically there. You're talking about, I believe it's almost 21. I have it. nearly 261 million troy ounces that are supposedly that are in America's gold holdings. If the gold is physically there or not, we won't know until we open the door. Personally, I think the gold likely is there, though there is an important point that deserves to be addressed, that the gold that is there, assuming it is in fact there, it does not meet current global market standards. America's gold holdings are not pure. They're about 90% pure because much of that gold is coin bars that were melted down. So they are raw, unpure bars. You can't trade them. They're not liquid today. So even if the bars are in fact there, there's a question of refinement that has to be answered. And while this bill that was introduced by Congressman Massey doesn't include this, we're hopeful to find Senate side sponsors that are going to introduce this bill in the U.S. Senate soon. And we're hoping that language pertaining to a refinement process can be inserted here because, like I mentioned, what good is a global gold reserve if it's not liquid, if it's not marketable? So America has to bring these standards up to comport to market standards so that in the case of actually needing to use these or needing to divest from the position or whatever the case is, that the gold is actually liquid. So that is another part that hopefully will be included in any future bill that is introduced. But then lastly, the question of leases and swaps. That is the bigger question to me than whether or not the gold is physically there. An ounce of gold can change hands thousands of times without moving a single inch. So the question as to who actually owns the bars outright is really the most crucial question. And if it is shown that America does not actually own the gold, if the gold is there, but America does not own it, if it has been pledged or leased or swapped or otherwise encumbered in any way, this would be a huge, huge detriment to the United States. And this would be a shock to the world, the global economy and the internal economy of the United States here. Also, the flip side of that is that it provides the opportunity for America to come out and confidently say, we have the gold. It's there. The world's greatest sound money is there, and we own more of it than anyone on the planet. And that would be a very powerful statement at a time, again, where BRICS countries are talking about creating alternatives, gold-backed dollars. You have Zimbabwe talking about creating gold-backed dollars at a time where you can look historically, and the history around paper money is pretty definitive. And we know that paper money has an expiration date. And the only way to restore this, to restore confidence and to keep America first in the global economy, the world economy, is to re-inject the honest weights and measures that come with gold and silver.
Okay. And of course, now we have to move on to, I think, the question everybody is wondering, which is this going to pass? What are your thoughts on that? I know that you've talked about the support that we could see from Donald Trump. Of course, there's a lot of talk about Fort Knox audit earlier in the year. Elon Musk was playing into that. Of course, now they're no longer getting along. So what are your thoughts on there? How do you think this plays out?
It's been really interesting to see kind of the development of this. The Sound Money Defense League, in coordination with Money Metals Exchange, has been working on this issue since the beginning, since our inception in 2014. But in 2019, we worked with Congressman Alex Mooney from West Virginia to introduce a version of this bill. And then in 2021, we worked to edit the bill further and introduce another version. And those two versions did not receive so much as a hearing. They were introduced. They may have gathered a handful of co-sponsors, but there wasn't so much as a hearing on the bill. But today, the monetary era in which we're living is shifting underneath our feet actively. And so there are more eyes attuned to America's money and its status as the global reserve currency. And by extension, questions about inflation and purchasing power and how monetary printing might affect or have a relationship with the general price level. So these questions are being asked more time than any time in recent history, certainly in my lifetime. And so starting from where we are with four co-sponsors on the House side is a great place to begin. The next step would be to get a Senate bill introduced, a companion bill companion bill on the Senate side of the House. So there are already several great potential sponsors on the Senate side. There are several senators who have spoken positively about sound money in the past, who have spoken about fiscal responsibility and getting America's finances in order. For example, son of Congressman Ron Paul, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky would be an excellent prospect of a sponsor here on a bill like this. It would match a lot of his verbiage, a lot of the things that he has said and stood for over the years. Looking further out to the west side of the country, Senator Mike Lee is another congressman who has spoken favorably about sound money, who has actively spoken about auditing the gold at Fort Knox. So we know that there's support there already in the other chamber. We know that there's support on the grassroots front. The fervor, going online at all, checking Twitter or X, going on YouTube, you see that there's a grassroots boiling point that's bubbling up on this issue. People have, second maybe only to auditing the Fed is a call to audit the gold. This is something that Americans have clung on to, and rightfully so, because that gold is theirs, and they have a right to know that it's secure and that it is in fact there. President Trump, like you mentioned, has already spoken favorably about an audit. Like you mentioned as well, Mr. Musk might be persona non grata in the administration, at least for right now. But the work that he did to draw attention to this issue, just tweeting about this issue, drawing millions and millions of eyes to the issue was incredibly powerful. Relative to congressional expenditure, an audit of America's gold would be minute. It would be as a question of congressional budget, what Congress normally spends its money on. An audit would be very, very cost effective, or very, very minimal in terms of cost, but it would give you something that you can't monetize or you can't put in a dollar terms, which would be confidence of taxpayers in the institutions that they use and interact with every day, confidence in global trading partners who interact and settle in the US dollar every day. So that would introduce transparency to the system. And like I said, the bipartisan call too. It would both parties are talking about opportunities to be more transparent, and this is one of them. So to give people this opportunity would be huge. And so we're hopeful that with support from the White House, with support from the grassroots, we'll be able to garner up enough support for the bill to eventually pass it, or at least receive a hearing.
Okay, well, we'll be watching to see what happens there. I think it's really interesting to hear about how long you've been working on something like this, and maybe now it's finally going to get to a point where it goes through. I wanted to ask, at the federal level, are there other sound money projects that you are pushing forward right now?
Yeah, the federal level is a level that we definitely devote less attention to than the state level, but there are fights on the federal level worth fighting. I think unsurprisingly, probably to many of your viewers, we find that the federal level tends to be less effective and less efficient than the state level. There's gridlock. There's a lot of political grandstanding. And so the actual art and act of making legislation and governing is something that gets lost on the federal level. That said, like we've discussed here, the Gold Reserve Transparency Act of 2025 is a federal legislative project worth fighting. Another one that we worked with in 2024, Congressman Alex Mooney reintroduced the Monetary Metals Tax Neutrality Act. This is a bill that would remove the federal capital gains tax on gold and silver. This would be massive because the only reason most states charge a capital gains tax on gold and silver is because most states start with their federal tax return, which charges this tax. So by removing this tax on the federal level, you would by default remove it in most states, except for the ones that have affirmatively imposed this tax themselves, most of which haven't. So removing that tax would maybe be the most effective thing that anyone could do to restore sound money, because the biggest impediment to people using sound money as money, to people using gold and silver as money today, is the friction of taxes. It's not possible to use gold and silver because of all of the taxes that encumber its use. But so by removing the friction and by allowing these rails to move more efficiently, people could, if they wanted, readopt their own gold standard and then eventually reach a critical mass where gold and silver are the money of the world, rather than this paper era that we've been in for at least since 1971.
So a little bit harder to move things along at the federal level. I think people will understand why that's the case. But I know that you've seen quite a bit of success at the state level. So any developments there this past year or since we last talked in November-ish of last year that you would want to bring up?
Well, 2025 has actually been like when we spoke in 2024. I'm happy to say that 2025 is the most legislatively successful year since the Sound Money Defense League started this project in 2014. This year, in 2024, when we last spoke, you and I were talking about how 7 out of 50 states had enacted pro-sound money legislation. I believe 20 or 25 states had introduced measures that were pertaining to gold and silver, removing taxes on the metals, reaffirming them as constitutional legal tender, empowering state treasurers to invest state funds in physical gold, creating multi-million-dollar stockpiles of physical gold for states that choose to do that. So last year, we were very excited about the 20 some odd states that had introduced this and 7 states that had passed it. I'm happy to say that this year, more than 35 states out of 50 have introduced legislation considering policies like this, and nearly a dozen have enacted them into law. This movement has reached a critical mass where more people are, like I said, asking questions about their money. You know, we have been told for many years, the questions regarding money have been typically reserved for the experts, for economists, for financial reserve central bankers. But today, as people are more readily struggling with the ability to afford basic necessities and rent and food and housing and transportation, the questions about money and what makes a good money and what traits you want a money to have are more pertinent than ever before. So states themselves are taking the mantle. They're moving away from the federal dysfunction, which is where all of this stems, and they're deciding to act proactively in favor of their own treasuries and of their individuals by re-implementing gold and silver, honest money, into their balance sheets, by removing any impediments to citizens in the state into readopting their own gold standard, into buying and selling the metals. And ultimately, since good policy tends to percolate upwards, we believe that as more and more states adopt these policies, we'll see that the federal government will then choose to adopt these policies, seeing that states have enacted them successfully.
Well, congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far this year. And I certainly hope 2025 continues down that pathway. I'll let you go for now, unless you had any final thoughts you wanted to share, maybe on the broader impact on the gold market of everything that we've been mentioning so far.
Well, as you've seen, it's been incredible to see the gold run of the last several months, and it's happening in lockstep with these legislative bills that are passing. You see gold hitting new all-time highs seemingly every other day, at the same time that not just other governments, but states themselves are actively de-dollarizing. Everyone is coalescing around gold because they have rediscovered it to be a political neutral, uninflatable, superior money to the fiat printing press that exists today. So more and more countries, adversaries and allies alike, are attuned and starting to coalesce and starting to gather around gold and silver. And I think we're going to see more of that. I don't think that changes. And the investment thesis, of course, isn't going to change so long as the government keeps printing money. So long as that's the case, holding sound money long term is going to be a good bet.
Well, perfect place, I think, to wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming on to go over everything that's in the bill. Very, very helpful for me in understanding, and hope to have you back again soon.
Thank you, Charlotte. It's good to be with you. Hope to talk soon.
Of course. And once again, I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingnews.com, and this is JP Cortez with Sound Money Defense League.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We'd also love to hear your thoughts, so leave us a comment below.